Alright, so you guys can see we got 45 wins in the Genetic Apex Emblem event, which is basically a PvP event. In today's video, we're going to show you guys the top 6 decks that I used to get to the 45 wins. Keep in mind, these are not going to be very cheap decks. They're going to have multiple EXs, so don't expect these to be budget friendly. But that being said, if you want to get to 45 wins as fast as you can, you got to use one of these decks. So the 6th deck on this list is going to be a Charizard meta deck. The whole deck revolves around Charizard, but more importantly, it has Moltres to develop your Charizard. Now, if we take a look at the deck list, you can see we're running Charmander, Charmeleon, 2 Charizards, 2 Moltreses. Those are going to be all the Pokemon that you need. And when you look at the trainers, they're the basic ones you'll use in most meta decks. 2 Potions, 2 XPs, 2 Pokeball, 2 Professor Research. And we are going to be running 2 Giovanni and Sabrinas, but as usual, you can sub these out. I've actually had some efficiency running, instead of 1 Sabrina, running 1 Fossil. But again, it's all based on your personal preferences. And like I mentioned, the whole point of this deck is to get the Moltres out in play. The Moltres ability for 1 Fire Energy Infernal Dance can actually progress your other Pokemon. So meaning that you can have the Moltres on turn 2 and attack, and then put him all onto your Charizards or your Charmanders who turn into Charizard. Charizard is incredible because 200 damage for 4 energy is very strong, but you do have to discard 2 energy. So you can deal a lot of damage with this Charizard, but the biggest downside of this deck is that you do need a Charizard to win. The reason I put this deck as number 6 is it doesn't have 2 types of ways to win the game. You can only really win the Charizard, because Moltres, as strong as the ability is, the Heat Blast only deals 70 damage, so you won't be able to deal against other EXs, whereas Charizard can one-shot people. So if you don't have the Charizard in your opening hand, or if you don't draw into your Charizard, this deck will draw dead. And even then, if you do get the Charizard and it gets killed, you're so behind compared to the other decks, it makes it really tough. However, this deck does do very well against some other meta decks, which I love about the metas because it's basically a game of rock, paper, scissors. Although there's a deck that's very strong, there's another deck that will beat it, and there's not going to be one specific deck that's way better than all other decks. Now, the 5th deck is going to be a Mankey meta deck, or I call it the Fighting Aggro deck. Now, the whole point of this deck is to revolve around the Mankey and the Primate, but you also have the late game advantage with the Marowak EXs as well as the regular Marowak in case you need some consistent damage. So if we take a look at the deck list, we're running the 2 Cubones, a 1 Hitmonlee, which is also a pretty good finisher in case somebody wants to retreat. We're running the Mankey, the newest Mankey. The newest Mankey is incredible. You deal 30 damage for 1 fighting energy, but you deal 10 damage himself. A lot of people might think this is a downside, but it's actually a huge upside, especially on this new Mankey, because it evolves into Primate. Primate, whenever he takes a damage, his attack deals more. So for 2 fighting energy, he basically does 40. However, if you have any damage, he will deal 100 damage, which if you can get this on curve, turn 2, use the Mankey, deal some damage. Turn 3, bring the Primate out, hit him, bang! You're popping off, or you can even kill the legendary birds if you have a Giovanni. And we are running the 2 Marowak EXs and one Marowak. I like the Marowak EX because you have the chance for the late game win. This can potentially knock out Mewtwo EXs, which is a weakness to this deck. You can get those early aggressive fights with the Primates, but in the end, when your opponent gets their Mewtwo out, you get the Marowak out and you have a chance to knock out the opponent's Mewtwo, which happens more often than not, but this is a great card. And then I'm also running the base Marowak because if you ever start the game and you have a Cubone Marowak, this is actually a really good start. You start off with the Cubone, you say go, and on your next turn, you bring out the Marowak, you do 40 damage, 100 HP is very tough to deal with, and then if you don't have the Primate, you can eventually retreat to bring out your other Cubone, so very strong. And then taking a look at trainers, as I mentioned, very similar to the other ones, if not exactly the same. 2 XP, 2 Pokeball, 2 Professor Research, 2 Giovannis, and 2 Sabrinas. Again, the Sabrinas and the Giovannis, they can be interchanged in these first 2 decks, but this Mankey deck is very, very strong. And what I really like about the deck is that it is super aggressive, super consistent. You bring out the Mankey, you have the Primate. The only really downside is the fact that Mankey, once he attacks, has 40 HP, and a lot of Pokemon deals 40 damage, which will knock out the Mankey, meaning you won't get the Primate going. And it does lose to some other decks, such as the Psychic deck, as well as the Water deck. I think the Water deck is probably the strongest against this deck because of how much HP they have and how fast they get going. But overall, a very strong deck, and that's why it's the 5th deck on this list. Now, the 4th deck of the list is going to be called the Misty meta deck. I call it the Misty meta deck because, let's be honest, this deck really revolves around getting Misty going. But you can still do very well without getting the coin flips. Now, the whole point of this deck is to have the Staryu or Articuno in front. Preferably, you want to have the Articuno EX because you want to use Misty. Misty is very strong. You flip a coin, for each heads you get, you'll put an energy on your water Pokemon. As soon as you get a tails, you will stop flipping coins, meaning that the upside is huge. If you turn 1, bring an Articuno, flip Misty, gets 3 heads, it's essentially GG. Your opponent really can't do anything against Articuno with 80 damage every single turn. You can potentially use Lapras instead, but I found Articuno is better because of the 2 retreat versus the 3 retreat that a Lapras has. Starmie is another reason why this deck is super strong. Even if you do not get the Articuno high roll, as they call it, Misty getting triple heads, let's be honest, that's high rolling. Starmie EX is one of the best EX Pokemons in the game. 130 HP, and the best part, 0 retreat. So you can have this on your bench as long as you want, have the Articuno being developed on front, deal damage, and if your opponent's Sabrina's, you bring out the Starmie and you just retreat for free. Or you can just deal 90 damage. And the trainers are your typical trainers. You got the 2 Potion, 2 XP, 2 Pokeball, Professor's Research, 2 Misties, 2 Giovannis, and 2 Sabrinas. And as usual, swap out however you want the Giovannis and Sabrinas. And like I mentioned, this deck is absolutely incredible, especially if you can get the triple heads on Misty. And even if you're going second, you only need 2 heads to really dominate with this Articuno. But the real show is the Starmie EX, honestly one of the strongest cards in the game. Now this deck is very good, but it has its downside. Now if you don't get any heads with the Misty, this becomes more of a mid-range deck, and it's not great when it comes to mid-range. It also has a weakness to Lightning, which is one of the best decks and most used deck in the meta, meaning that you can get destroyed by the 95%, okay, probably not 95%, let's be honest, it's probably 50% of the chance that you're gonna go up against the Pikachu deck, and that Pikachu deck will destroy this deck. Also against the Mewtwo deck, this deck does not do as well because Mewtwo can knock out any of these EXs while being able to stall out. So overall, a very good deck, but it doesn't beat some of the top decks. So number 3 is gonna be the Mewtwo meta deck, and I'll be honest, number 2 and 3 are gonna be super duper close, but I'm gonna give an advantage for the other deck because it's just gonna be faster than this one. However, this deck is still really strong. The Mewtwo deck, the whole premise of this deck is get the Mewtwo in play and then try to get the Gardevoir. Once you get the Gardevoir, you can basically deal 150 damage every single turn. And as you guys can see, the deck list is 2 Ralphs, 2 Kirlia, and 2 Gardevoir, as well as 2 Mewtwo's. Now Gardevoir's ability, basically, you add a Psychic Energy to the active Pokemon. So as soon as you get 2 energy on your Mewtwo and you have a Gardevoir on the bench, you will be popping off dealing 150 damage every single turn. Optimally, you want to get the Mewtwo in the starting active, and then you want to have the Kirlia / Ralts in your bench, eventually get into the Gardevoir so that you can get the Mewtwo to pop off. Now the reason this deck is better than the Mewtwo deck is because Charizard is a stage 2, meaning you have to develop the Charizard to deal damage. However, Mewtwo EX is a basic Pokemon, meaning you can have it right on the battlefield, put energy and attack right away. Yes, this is going to be the similar style where you can't develop and do well without the Gardevoir. However, because Mewtwo has that 2 energy attack, you can at least deal a bit of damage early on with the Psychic Sphere and eventually try to get to that side drive if you don't have the Gardevoir. You can't really do that with the Charizard deck because you have to get the 3 pieces to get the Charizard, and the Moltres has to attack to give the energy, whereas Gardevoir does not. Now the rest of the deck list is typical: 2 trainers, 2 X-Speeds, 2 Pokeball. I am running the 1 Old Amber in this situation, Professor's Research, 2 Giovannis, and 1 Sabrina. Again, swap out however you want. I found the Old Amber is really good because a lot of people do want to Sabrina me whenever I have a Gardevoir or a Kirlia on the bench, and Old Amber will prevent that. And what I really like is the consistency of the Mewtwo just being on the front side and then being able to bring out the Gardevoir. Yes, it's gonna be tough to get the Gardevoir, so if you want to get like a Meowth in there, I've seen variants of that. Now the biggest downside of this deck is the fact that if you don't have the Gardevoir, this deck is gonna be a lot slower, and 150 damage doesn't guarantee you a knockout like the Charizard deck. But the Mewtwo can get itself going by dealing 50 damage and another 50 damage and then 150 damage to kill something else at the end, which it makes it really strong. It does, however, lose to the next 2 decks. The Lightning X is substantially faster, and the first deck will sustain over this deck. Now the second place deck is going to be a Lightning meta deck. The version that I'm running is not the most optimal one, but the one that I use is a good variant, so that way you can still run this deck and still pop off. And this deck typically is going to be number 3 over the Mewtwo deck, but if I had to do like a overall ranking, I have to put the Lightning deck over the Mewtwo deck. Now the whole point of this deck is to get as much Pokemons on the bench while having your Pikachu EX on your front line dealing damage. He deals 30 damage for each of your bench Lightning Pokemons, meaning that if you go second, you can have the Pikachu dealing 90 damage on your second turn, which is incredible. but I am running a kind of different tech. We are going to be using the Voltorb and Electrode. I think Electrode is absolutely incredible. It's like a budget Starmie EX. 80 HP, which is a little bit low, but 70 damage for 2 lightning energy and a free retreat. Free retreat is absolutely incredible, meaning you can get the Electrode, and if anybody ever tries to Sabrina you just bring that Electrode and sub back out. So yes, 2 Electrodes gonna be used, 2 Pikachu EXs, as well as 1 Pikachu and 1 Raichu. This is where the secret tech comes along. We actually have the Raichu. The Raichu ability is very strong, 140 damage for 3 lightning energy, but you discard all the energies. We're using that with the Lieutenant Surge. This can be a sneaky combo that comes out of nowhere so that you can deal 140 damage out of nowhere to kill a lot of Pokemons. This is pretty good since it kills most of the birds, if not all the birds. So honestly, it kills all the birds, so that's why it's very strong. And we're running the basic Zapdos because I don't have the Zapdos EXs, but the Zapdos is still pretty decent because it's still 1 retreat and it's a body on the field. When you talk about the trainers, we're running the potions, the X-Beats, the Pokeball, Professor Research, Sabrina's, and Giovanni. So like I mentioned, typical deck, but this one probably has less trainer because you have more Pokemons. If I had to do this deck, I would probably add an extra Zapdos. Like instead of having the Pikachu and the Raichu, I would just have Zapdos EXs, and this would be a super meta deck. Now, like I mentioned, the whole point of this is to get your Pikachu in your active spot, get all the lightning Pokemons on your bench, and start dealing 90 damage. And then if your Pikachu starts taking too much damage, you swap out into your Pikachu or even your Electrode. 70 damage can finish off a lot of Pokemons, as well as the Raichu. Now, this is going to be the fastest deck in the meta. This actively beats a lot of decks, except for the fighting deck because of weakness, and the Mankey makes it very tough to go up against, as well as the #1 deck. Now, like I said, the biggest weakness, if you don't have the Pikachu, it's kind of tough to go ahead. And if you don't have the lightning Pokemon on the bench, it's kind of tough to go ahead. If you go against a Mankey deck, which honestly, because of the new Mankey, there's so many of those decks being played that it actually loses to that deck, unless your opponent gets unlucky. But honestly, the Pikachu deck is very strong, and that's why it's my #2 pick. Now, the #1 deck might shock you, but I do think that the meta grass deck is the best deck currently in this meta. Now, this deck revolves around having the Executor EX on the front line while you have the Venusaur being developed on the bench. So the reason why this deck does so well is because of Executor EX, 160 HP, and you deal 40 damage for 1 energy. But if you flip ahead, you'll deal 80 damage. That will knock out a lot of Pokemons that are going to be in their starting line. Now think about it this way. If you go first, you get to execute and play, and next turn you evolve into your Executor, you can attack right away and deal 80 damage. That is the potential to get the first turn win. And 160 HP as a tank is really, really good. So you can eat up a lot of the attacks while dealing a bunch of damage. Now, biggest downside is the triple retreat. So most likely this Pokemon will be just sucking up all the damage and then eventually retreating into your Venusaur. Speaking of Venusaur, 190 HP is the most in the game. Giant Plume is fantastic. 100 damage and you heal yourself for 30. If you get this in play, it is impossible to kill except for the Charizard. But the real MVP of this deck is Erica. Healing 50 damage on your grass type Pokemon is incredible. On average, Pokemons will deal about 50 damage. So your Pokemon is going to be dealt 50 damage, you're going to heal with the Erica. That's basically like hitting a time stop. Right? Your opponent just wasted their turn attacking, not doing anything. You bring out the Erica. You combine that with the Venusaur, and you'll be healing like crazy. But like I mentioned, the deck list is very simple. Bulbasaur's executes, Ivysaur executors, Venusaurs. We're running the 2 XPs, the 2 Pokeball, Professor's Research, Erica, Sabrina, Giovanni's. Now, I could see myself swapping out the XPs for potions if you want to have more heals. So the reason I'm running XP is sometimes you have the Bulbasaur in your starting spot, and then you have the Execute on your bench, and then you might draw into your Executor, and you kind of want to have the Executor in the front line. But with the X speed, you'll be able to retreat, bringing the Executor, and also attach the energy and deal damage. So that's why I'm running the X speed. And honestly, this deck is incredible. You just tank so much with the Executor EX, and then eventually you win the game with the Venusaur EX. It doesn't lose to the Pikachu deck. It doesn't lose to the Mewtwo deck. It doesn't lose to the fighting deck. Really, it loses only to the Charizard deck. The Charizard deck will beat this out just because of the Moltres dealing 9 damage, which will kill the Ivysaur and Executor in 2 turns, and the Charizard one-tapping the Venusaur. However, you don't see the Charizard deck as much as the other 5 decks on this list because it requires 4 EXs to run, and people much rather use the Water deck if you're going to run 4 EXs. And it is, in my opinion, the best deck in the meta. So those are going to be my top 6 decks if you want to get your 45 wins fast. These are the highest winners that I ran with, and And if you have the Venusaur deck, you run that, but the Pikachu deck, in my opinion, is probably the easiest to run and beat. You can probably get that and destroy most of the other decks, but this is my deck list. You guys let me know if you like these decks. If there's any decks that I didn't add that you think is competitive, you let me know in the comments down below. Maybe I'll do a video for all the budget versions of it that you can use in here, but because I've already gone 45 wins, I might do it for the next event. But you guys let me know. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!